Here's a S200 from a Caterpillar that I did an HX40 conversion on. So I'm going to show you a couple details of what I had to do to make this work. The S200 bearing housing is a little bit different. It's smaller in size. So I just took an HX40 bearing housing and I just machined it down to be able to fit into the S200 compressor housing. Once the bearing housing is machined, I can take the compressor housing, bolt it to the bearing housing while it's on the machine, and then I surfaced it out here. That way I know everything is in symmetry and I can just grab it here as long as the chucks are surfaced, and then start machining on the back side. This is a 60 by 86 7-blade HX40 compressor wheel. You can see I also machined the bearing housing for an O-ring here. So a lot of this had to get cut down and a lot of this area had to get cut down. Then I measured from here to here and machined it exactly to the S200 spec for the bearing housing. And then the turbine housing, I machined it for a 64 by 76 millimeter HX40 turbine. I had to machine it for the bearing housing and the turbine wheel. You can see this ridge here. It used to be bigger than the HX40 bearing housing, so I had to machine it for depth. But I would have had to machine it for depth anyway, because the HX bearing housing needs to sit in farther than the S200 does, because the S200 is just a little bit different the way it's made and stuff. So the HX did have to sit in deeper, so it actually worked out pretty well. I had to surface this down quite a bit. I probably cut like 2 or 3 millimeters off this, and then the depth, I cut that a lot. Then I machined it for the turbine wheel and the radius. Before, the turbine did rub really bad, so I was having to machine out where the turbine had rubbed and the metal was stuck to it. This thing is really pitted up and rusty, so before I could do the machining on the exhaust side, I had to grab it on the bearing housing side and machine it here so I have a good surface to grab. That way I can align it on the bearing housing side to be able to machine it for the wheel and bearing housing. Still have to trim it up a little bit in here, but all the machine work's done. This is your wastegate port on the S200. Here you can see the wastegate port. Oh, that's a bunch of metal that I just cut out. I forgot to air it out. Your flap is on the side. Here's how well the bearing housing machine work turned out to the compressor outlet. Let's see if I can get a good close-up here. You can see how little needs to stick up. Usually it's about 10 to 20 thousandths. I think it's more along the lines of 20 thousandths, especially on the exhaust housing side. That sticks up there. I'll show you what the exhaust housing looks like installed. This is what it looks like with the exhaust housing installed, where it's machined out to the 64 millimeter turbine wheel.